Welcome to the show, John. Happy to have you. Of
Happy to be here, Dan. Thank you for having me.
course. And before jumping into this first question, now that I think of it, I think it's good for the audience to have an understanding of how this came to be and what this conversation and say quote unquote debate is going to be really about, which is immigration. But John, you want run this popular account on both Twitter, Netflix, you have your own YouTube channel called Counterpoints, which is a populist left wing account that provides perspectives on both sides, but also the left wing side obviously is that's the position you take in a number of issues. But on one of your videos, I saw that you're offering, say, both perspectives, and I thought, someone else could provide that perspective with more justice, say, more validity. And you were kind enough to, indulge and set this up. So one, I thank you for that because going into conversations with someone that you may not agree with is not always fun, or you may not be like so willing to. So I definitely, commend and thank you for that. And then two, it's just good for the audience to know that when you're going into a conversation that you're certainly unsure about how the other person may feel, it's always good to have that respect towards, that mutual respect. And I think John and I established that and look forward to this kind of like first question, which is when thinking about the current immigration, say, policy and how things are going in the United States, what comes to mind? What do you think some pain points are, and what would you recommend as some alleviation to those pain points?
Yeah. So first of all, to just agree with what you said there, because I think it's more important than anything we'll discuss today, is you're completely correct. When you approach someone who you disagree with, it's very important to be respectful, to, understand that they're coming from a completely different background than you are. And I always try and convey that in what I do in the minute and a half TikToks I make. The nuance cannot always be there all the time. So I appreciate the opportunity to have a more in-depth conversation about these things. In terms of what is going on right now, I'll just, come forth and say it. I'm a advocate for open borders. I think that one of the problems, the big problems that we have in this country is that we are being flooded with illegal immigrants, and that is a problem. I do recognize the problem when you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions over time, people coming across the border that you just can't account for. It's not a good thing for a country. My solution to that is to greatly reduce the barriers to entry so that there's no longer an incentive for people to come illegally. Uh, Essentially, we're putting people, an average wait period of 2 years. In some countries, it can be up to 10. And we're telling them, okay, either you have to wait years and years and years in this country that may or may not be safe, that does not have economic opportunity for your family, or come over illegally. And those are the two options that we're presenting to people, or don't come at all. But a lot of these people don't view that as an option, right? So, what are we going to do about it? When we put those barriers to entry, we incentivize people to come in illegally. I don't think that those barriers to entry are worth it. I think that it would be better to have those people just come in, become documented, start living and working here, paying taxes, starting a family, all of those good things. And really, what's stopping that from happening is our own dedication to spending billions of dollars to stop them.
Mm-hmm. From your perspective too, which I think this is kind of interesting because this is what people on the free market right would advocate for as well.
Mm-hmm.
Open borders policy for, boost the economy, boost innovation, and have a larger labor market. But does that not concern you, the labor piece of it? For example, with a larger labor market, that there may be, less incentive for any kind of established wages past a certain point when you can get cheaper labor in essence. And to quickly, I guess, provide a historical anecdote to this, we saw this in England when Ireland had the Great Famine between like 1846 and 1852. There's a number of migrants that emigrated from Ireland to England. And this caused a lot of tension between the classes in England and Ireland. And who were ultimately served was the British aristocracy. And Karl
Mm-hmm.
Marx, funny enough, was a huge critic of this as well, even detailing it to his American friends in a letter. So I am curious about your concerns on that, if there are any.
So I think you brought up a great point there that there are you introduced me as a left wing person, but I think this is one of those issues where the left kind of claims it for ourselves, but it is also a very right-wing issue when you think of
Hmm.
limiting government interference. Like borders, we think of them as just an innate part of our country, but they are the government restricting freedom of movement. It's a massive government restriction, and part of that is the labor market. Now, there's kind of, I guess, two questions here when it comes to the labor market. One is, does this immigration actually reduce native wages? And we've seen many, many economists come forward, including, I forget his first name, but Card is his last name. He won the Nobel Prize 2 or 3 years ago for studying this issue and finding that immigration doesn't actually have a net negative impact on the wages of native workers. And that is because when people come here and they start working here and they start making money here, they also start spending money here.
Hmm.
And so, because they are here and spending that money, it generates more demand here for labor. And so, there are more jobs and wages to go around. The alternative to this is those people doing the same or similar jobs back in their country and us outsourcing our labor. And to me, the way that I see it, the border actually really only helps those companies that you're talking about that are outsourcing their labor to other countries where they can pay people less. If all of those skilled laborers come here to do the same job, and of course, not every job is fungible, like farming, we can only do here, right? Because there's land. But we're talking in general here. Um, what I have seen is that often what happens is the companies end up lobbying for immigration restrictions because they want to have their labor force over in Nicaragua, over in Mexico, over wherever it is where there's a lower cost of living and they can pay them pennies. Instead, if they come here, not only are they making more money, and that's generally a good thing in my opinion. But they're also more likely to spend their money here. So instead of all of that money just being outsourced and then coming back here, it's being put back into the American economy. And so that is why I view the labor issue as not so much of an issue. And on top of that, by the way, it's usually only a short-term issue because long-term, those immigrants have families. And every single one of us eventually had an immigrant who made them be here.
Hmm.
So unless you think that those immigrants who built this country, as most people agree on, didn't provide an actual value to this country in their labor, I don't see why the immigrants who are coming over now would be any different. I would rather them have generations of their family working here than working in Mexico, where American companies are going to export my job and pay them less to do it there.
I think that's a fair point. Simultaneously, though, you do see the children of immigrants being disproportionately poorer than the immigrants say themselves or compared to second generation children of other families. And this is something that Rehan Salam goes into, who authored a number of books, one being The Case Against Open Borders from the Son of the Immigrants. And what he speaks to is that we don't really have the infrastructure in place to support, say, economic mobility for a lot of these immigrants coming in. And that's where I think a large concern would come to when we speak about borders and when we speak about mass migration is like we may be providing them a job, but what job is that? And what living conditions are they living in? So, for example, in California, which has the highest poverty rate in the across the United States, there's also a 6% workforce estimated. 6% of their labor market is undocumented immigrants. So I think my point being here is as well is what kind of guarantees are we actually providing them? And secondary, are we actually doing a net harm to these other nations that they're coming from, such as Nicaragua or Mexico? For example, I mean, you look at Ethiopia. This is another random country in Africa, but there's more practicing physicians in Chicago today than there are in all of Ethiopia out of 80 million. So that's my concern is a brain drain. So if you come at from like the economic point of view, you could say that maybe it's a net benefit to the United States, which I'm not sure if it is, if we're not able to really provide the infrastructure for economic mobility for these people. but I would also argue that it's not a net benefit really for the rest of the world either, when there is no economic opportunity, or if there is very little of it, there's no really development of their workforce there and they're all just leaving.
So brain drain, I'll put it this way. I feel like all of the issues that you just listed are secondary issues that are
Hmm.
exacerbated by open borders, not necessarily an issue that open borders directly would be causing. For example, you mentioned how we don't have the infrastructure here to handle that. And I actually agree. I think if we snapped our fingers and said open borders tonight, that would be a mistake because we don't have the processes in place,
Hmm.
the infrastructure in place to be able to just handle that influx all at once. But that's a problem with infrastructure, not with immigration. Like to say, okay, we need to limit immigration because we don't have the infrastructure. Well, that's just like to me kicking ourselves in the nuts because why not just build the infrastructure then? Like that would be the solution to that problem to me, not limiting immigration.
Hmm.
Brain drain is also a legitimate issue. Like brain drain in many countries is a legitimate issue, especially poorer ones. And that's a more difficult one to solve. However, I mean, there have been many, many studies on the economic impacts of labor mobility of open borders. And what is the specific one? I believe, yeah, this one from the journal, the BE Journal of
Hmm.
Macroeconomics by Paul Klein and Gustavo Ventura estimates that open borders globally, and I'm not just talking in America, but globally, if we had open borders, it would add $100 trillion to the global economy. And most of that
Hmm.
would be in the global south, more poor regions. And the reason for this, I mean, if anyone in your audience is a fan of free market economics, it's kind of the same thing. Is that all of these borders are just needless restrictions on the labor market. If you look at basically any trade restriction, any tariff, it generally produces a lower net overall global GDP because of that tariff's existence. It might provide some protectionism to the home country, right? But it overall, the net impact is just a less efficient production because if someone can do a job but they are not allowed to because they're not allowed to move to the location that job needs to be done, well, then that job then goes to someone else who doesn't deserve it as much. And that person might even be paid more. So we have to pay more for less productivity, right? So really, like if you're a free market economist, it should be pretty obvious why loosening restrictions on the labor market globally would have positive net impact on the global economy. Is that
Hmm.
going to cause some brain drain in certain areas, especially in the short term? Yes. But if you look at like the history of this, I mean, before World War One, we didn't really have borders in the same way we do now. Like we didn't really limit immigration to the same level. And part of that was just we didn't have the ability or manpower to like guard the entire American border. But we basically had migrants going between America and Mexico all the time. And they would come here, they do, summer work, and then they'd go back home, spend the money there. The net impact of this is that when people come here from Nicaragua, from wherever, they're going to make more money, and a lot of that money is going to go back home to their family in the poorer country. They're not just going to keep it all here. And while we would want them to, that money going back is more money than they're ever going to be able to make over in Nicaragua. So that also increases demand now in Nicaragua, increases the amount people are able to pay for doctors in Nicaragua. And so it increases the incentives for people to stay in Nicaragua and be doctors. Is it completely painless? No, but neither is the system we currently have.
I think it's interesting, but if you look at Mexico, for example, like 8 years post NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that wages dropped by 22%, even though worker productivity increased by over 40%. And I don't think it's exactly clear cut that this is a net positive. And I will also point out that there is contrary, conflicting evidence on whether mass migration lowers or decreases wages for, say, that native population that you're pointing out. And to the point of in the early, like pre-World War One, before World War One happened, and there wasn't really established processes and offices to own this kind of task. Like I would also point out that there wasn't really economic or excuse me, mobility for people to get around, such as cars, transportation, infrastructure, roads. And now that has obviously changed, and the economic opportunity, say, landscape has changed post World War II, especially America becoming the major superpower. So I think that's fair. But what a question I guess I beg to ask is, what like merits does the open borders case have, do you think? Like, do you usually approach it from a labor point of view, or do you think there's a moral one as well? Where do you usually fall on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can approach it from both directions. Like
Hmm.
that labor, that economic thing, I would consider more of a honestly a right-wing position, like
Hmm.
more freedom of movement, more less restrictions on the labor market, that sort of thing. And from just a pure dollars and cents perspective, and this has been proven time and time again, immigrants, either legal or illegal, generate more tax revenue than they consume in benefits over the course of their lifetime. And as I mentioned before, it's not just them, it's however many generations of their family are now here and generating tax revenue that wouldn't have been here otherwise. And so that will impact us 50 years, 60 years, 100 years from now. But to me, it just doesn't make fiscal sense to spend billions of dollars to keep people out of this country who we know on average are going to give us more money than they're going to take from us. Assuming that we're able to have the infrastructure in place to be able to handle that influx, it seems stupid to me to spend our money stopping people from giving us their money, right? And some people will say, no, that's not true. They're not going to. They're going to be a net drain on society. And to that, I just say, do some research.
Hmm.
Look that up and see if it's true. I'm sure you can find some conflicting studies to what I'm saying, but that is what I have been able to understand from what I've read. The philosophical argument, I also think is a more interesting argument to have, because to me, I feel like the economic argument is pretty simple. It's, hey, we should bring more people into this country. Also, the demographic argument, we're not replacing our population, and we need immigrants to do that. That's a whole other story though. But the philosophical argument, I always think of it like this. I didn't do diddly squat to get an American citizenship. I was just lucky enough that my parents happened to get laid at the right time in the right place, right? And I didn't do anything to deserve the right to live here, to deserve the right to work here. Same thing goes for every person who was born somewhere else. Like, to me, a restriction on immigration is denying someone a right based on their nationality, which is always morally wrong to me. I don't think that just because you're born in a certain place means that you should be denied the right to live and work here. That it really doesn't make sense to me from a philosophical perspective, as much as it doesn't make sense to me from a economic one either.
Hmm. Yeah, following up on that. So how do you approach a state being able to regulate and control their own borders then? For example, if there, as you know, correctly pointed out when you first, opened up, was that there are hundreds of thousands, like in August of this past year, over 300,000 illegal entries, illegal immigrants entering the country. So where do you fall down on the state being able to regulate that on putting a certain number to that? And I also think it's fair to call out too that when people come here, they may not they may want to come here, but they may not want to come here because they love America, but rather they want to get away from the lack of economic opportunity in their home country, which I think is a fair kind of concern. Back in 2015, there was like this concerning poll, but you see this across the Middle East and just different cultures overall of how they feel about women's rights, how they feel about LGBTQ rights, and how that is a concern for different cultures coming in and not really wanting to assimilate or have it being a melting pot, but rather they leave because they feel like they need to. And I'll reference a specific poll too.
Mhm.
There's one lost in Britain back in 2015 where they were asking their British Muslim population how they felt about pretty much LGBTQ community, but mainly gay people. And they said well, do you feel that is okay for, a gay person to be a teacher? And almost 50%, 47% said no. Now, someone can compare that and be like, oh, the low approval ratings for that, you could see maybe something in the Republican Party or in that, like, say, the far, part of that. But my
Mhm.
point being is there concern with the lack of even like a cultural assimilation or wanting to be a part of this country?
Yeah, to that I would say no, and
Hmm.
for a couple of reasons. One, because wanting to be a part of this country wasn't a requirement for me to become a citizen.
Hmm.
Needing to assimilate into this culture wasn't a requirement for me to become a citizen. I didn't have any culture. I didn't care about this country whatsoever when I became a citizen. I was just crying, right? Like that's
Hmm.
that. So like to me, that was never a distinction we made for Native American citizens. Why would we make that distinction for citizens from other places? That seems like an unfair disadvantage we're placing on other people based solely on their nationality. But that doesn't necessarily mean, even if I think philosophically that's wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean there won't be any problems due to issues with cultural assimilation. And to that, I'll say we've had these issues for the entire history of our country. We have, as for most of our country's history, again, we didn't have closed borders like we do now. We just kind of let anyone come here, basically. I mean, when Staten Island existed to just, you know, shove through thousands and thousands and thousands of immigrants, and there was totally problems with cultural assimilation.
Hmm.
That's why Chinatown exists. That's why Little Italy exists. Like there's the places where all those immigrants came to and ended up being, and then were here for generations. But you see over time that kind of just takes care of itself. People have their kids and they're born here and they're Americans and they assimilate into this culture. And before we know it, oh, cool, they're just Americans now, just in the same way that I'm not an Irishman, I'm an American, right? And that is a self solving problem. That might cause some conflict in the short term, but I think that the cost of the long term cost of that isn't worth it. And I also don't think that if people think differently than we do, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like again, to kind of go back to the conservative side, make the conservative argument, it's the free marketplace of ideas. If they don't want to assimilate, that's fine. They don't have to. I don't have to assimilate. Native born Americans
Hmm.
don't have to assimilate. We create our culture. It's a constantly changing melting pot, as you said. And if we stop ingredients from entering that melting pot, well, that's ruining the melting pot. So that's how I feel about it.
I think it's fair points. I think it's also fair concerns when people who actively don't really want to come here, but yet do. And I think we may just have a fundamental disagreement where you're bringing up that you were born here, that you weren't really tested. You have to like, feel about, you didn't have to give your beliefs on how you felt about any specific issue. That makes sense. I think from a state point of view or just from a nationality point of view, um, it could be concerning when people are just leaving and wanting to come, and they may be not wanting to be a part of the country, but rather just leaving X place. And instead of trying to maybe remedy that or be more so put out a solution where America is developing countries putting in economic aid. We're just inviting in, we're pretty much having open borders and not having any limit on our immigration policy.
My question to that is always, why do like how do I put this? I
Hmm.
feel like there is a default in America that we need an immigration policy. We need to cap the amount of
Hmm.
immigrants. But excuse me, sorry. My genuine question to that is why? Why is it bad if our culture changes? Why is it bad if we have totally new ideas? To me, I don't think America stands for anything. I think
Hmm.
America, the whole concept to me of America is freedom, is we get to create, this is an experiment. We get to create with it whatever we want. And so I think there's this default to, oh, America is good for a lot of Americans. What we have here is good, and other people bringing new ideas is bad because we're America, we're the best, and we are better than those people who are coming over here and trying to change our culture. But to me, I think that that's a very limiting perspective. Like, I want to be challenged constantly. I come
Mhm.
on this show knowing that, you're not going to agree with me because I want to put my ideas to the test. I want to talk, and I want to hear other ideas and see if they're better than mine. And I feel like that's how successful people operate. It's the unsuccessful people who never want to hear anyone's ideas, who want to only surround themselves with yes men. And I think you apply that to a state level. The best thing we can do is let the different parts of the culture compete and just continue to transform constantly as fast as possible in order to be at the best country that we can be.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair point. I think it's a fair point. I think it's more or less just a concern, and it's not more. It's less a culture and more or less a resentment of a place. Like if, for example, this this may come off like as this callous argument, but it's really not.
Mhm.
Israel, for example, wants or suggested at one point that they want to move the Palestinians or that a United States should take in the Palestinians, like all of them, which I
Mhm.
disagree with for a number of reasons. But there will be a number of concerns is that, the United States is closely tied to Israel. And there's a lot of animosity obviously between those two populations. If we were to take in a culture, or not culture, excuse me, if we were taking people that just simply, it's not about like they have different beliefs, and maybe I approach this in the wrong way, but simply just have a resentment towards the quote unquote West or that state, I think you're possibly putting your population in a certain way that's undermining their safety. And I think you could make that case. And I think not that I agree with Trump's like quote unquote Muslim ban, but there was a case where these people may not want to come here and they may actually just actively not like Americans or not like X. And you may be okay with like, those people coming here, but it's less about ideas and more so just for me concerns about how someone may just simply feel about like an American themselves. And
So,
I'll close with this too, because this is something that Rehan Salam makes in his book for a case against open borders from like the son of an immigrant's perspective. And he says like places in Sweden when immigration was more welcome, say there, they still saw more or less a distinction in living in say the native Swedish population and the immigrants. And he quoted this as a curated diversity, where you could put a sign up on your window and saying, we welcome all, but no one in your neighborhood is going to no one in your neighborhood is going to really be like of welcome all because no one can buy into it. Immigrant like coming in recently is not going to be able to afford that property. So I think it's just much easier said than done. And I don't say it's be callous or them anti-immigration. It's just more or less concern about the well-being of the population here when there could be someone coming in from a different part of the world that doesn't really like you but feels like they need to escape that place, understandably so, say, but this is where they just need to go. And to ensure to close that out, like with the curated diversity, as he called it, like you can get as much as you want of it. And you see that almost all the time. Like I feel like here in the States, like, oh, there's this new, Lebanese place or this new Japanese place. But the minute you don't want that, say, quote unquote diversity, you can just like go back. You can just go back to your neighborhood. And this is not for everyone, but a lot of people probably have that lifestyle that they have as much diversity in their life as they want and no more. So that's I know there's a couple points, but I wanted to lay that out more in a succinct manner of like it's not, I guess, a lack of culture, but lack of just simply anti-American sentiment. And like I said, maybe I originally put that in the best way, but that's where it's the less of ideas and just more so just active like hatred or resentment for say understandable reasons too of what has happened in the past.
yeah, no, and that was a lot of points. I'm going to try to respond to all of them, but if I miss one, I'm not trying to dodge the question.
No,
There's
you're
just a lot
fine.
of them.
No, you're totally fine.
First of all, this is more of just an offshoot, but I think it's
Hmm.
interesting to be said is that you brought up Israel, and there's a lot of conflict over there right now,
Hmm.
and has been ever since Israel was created as a state. Now, why was Israel originally created as a state? Well, there was a lot of Jews in Europe, specifically, that weren't safe there because a lot of people didn't like them. And they're like, oh, where do we take the Jews after the Holocaust? And all of the European countries went, I don't want them. And America, if you look at polls from the time, only 18% of Americans said yes to the polling question of should we allow Jewish refugees, after World War II. And so we're just like, oh, well, the UK was like, oh, well, we own that strip of land over there. We'll give it to them and we'll just get out of there. And we see the problem that has caused. One way or the other, that has caused a lot of conflict. And if the Americans had just brought in that Jewish population, we've seen Jewish people have been relatively pretty darn safe here, and we haven't had any issues like that. I don't think we would have here if we had accepted that Jewish population at the time, right? So
Hmm.
I think that is kind of a counterexample to the example in and of itself. But anyway, moving past that, I wish I had prepared this specific study. I don't have it popped up, so I don't have a name for it. But I do know that I don't know if it was the American or the British military, but when they started desegregating the military, right, allowing black
Hmm.
specifically this is on ships, like black Navy men on ships with white Navy men. Everyone was like, oh, well, it's never going to work. Well, they put those people out on ships, they returned, and they did before and after, like, hey, how do you feel about this? And they found time and time again that the ships, the white people on ships with black people on them were less racist afterwards than the white people who were segregated by themselves. Yes, there was definitely conflict on a lot of those ships because of the cultural differences, the racial divides, all of that. But I mean, you can look at this time and time again. When you have diversity, when you experience personally, firsthand, someone else's culture, you gain more respect for it. You see
Hmm.
it with the LGBT community, like people who you hear this all the time. We're like, oh, I didn't understand it until my granddaughter or whatever. I saw it personally and how it was whatever. When people are exposed to different cultures, they become more accepting of them. And so, yeah, you're right. There's totally issues with, so I don't remember exactly what you called it, but selective segregation, where I remember even when I went to college here in New York of all places, I was shocked by how darn segregated the college was because it just seemed like all the black guys, all the black people hung
Hmm.
out, all the Asian people hung out, and all the white people hung out, and every once in a while mingled at a frat party, right? And so you do have some selection bias that is always going to be apparent. But the thing is, if you think that's a problem, well, then forcing lack of diversity isn't going to help. Those people aren't going to become more accepting of multiculturalism when the whatever group of people isn't here. They're only going to get more accepting of multiculturalism with direct exposure to other cultures. And over time, that lessens. Look at Italians in America. They used to basically be a minority. I mean, basically, they were a minority group. Like, people were very racist against Italians.
Hmm.
Now, Italians are just American. They're just white,
Hmm.
but they didn't always used to be considered white. And that's because of just they were here, generations went by, and now it's just all assimilated. Italians still have their own culture. They still have, you could go to an Italian family. There's still differences between an Irish family, between a black family, between whatever. But over time, they assimilate. I don't think that someone coming over here and hating America is necessarily a problem because I know many Americans that hate America. I'm not too fond of America.
Hmm.
Like, I love my country, but to me, like, I don't like where my country is going. I don't like where my country is right now. I
Yeah.
don't like my government. And so, like, to say, oh, well, this person shouldn't be here because they hate America. Well, they're only going to hate America more if we don't let them come here and they want to be here. Like,
Hmm.
that's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, I would say two things there, and I feel like it's becoming more of obscure point because most of our migration's coming from like the southern hemisphere, like
Mm-hmm.
Guatemala, Venezuela, and they're Venezuela specifically. They're trying to like escape like say socialism or just what's happening there in that specific government with Maduro.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll close this with two things because I think you make compelling arguments, but none. I'm not speaking to culture. And something that you said, like, you're not too like fond of America, but, like, did America like kill your father? Did America kill your brother? You know, whether you're speaking to a drones strike through our campaign there in the Middle East, that's what I'm speaking to. And the southern border, and I think we probably would agree on this point, the southern border is very penetrable at this point, to say the least. And that's what I'm saying is a concern of mine. Like, there was a poll recently in uh, Tunisia. I probably not pronounced that correctly. But country in Northern Africa. And Biden has 6% approval rating there. That's not really an indication in of itself, but what I'm saying is, in essence, it's less about culture, and that's why I think my original point maybe might have been a little misguided, but more so about how the United States has, the government specifically, has prosecuted different campaigns in certain regions of the world and has created this all around resentment. And that is something that I would say would be a concern, where someone may just want from national security reasons, but may just simply, it's not more so I don't like America. Like, I simply have this absolute resentment and hatred for Americans. Because I think what you're speaking to, you don't like the United States government. And I don't think a lot of people are a fan of the United States government, but there may not be that distinction or delineation between the two. American bomb or just anything that happens to your family, friends, loved ones that's supported by America, say that's going on in Israel right now with or Gaza through Israel by American taxpayer dollars, like essentially American subsidizing that. So that's what I'm saying I have concerns with. And it's not to say like I don't care about those people. I want those people to be well, but more so that I don't think we should just be so cavalier in taking people in. That's my point when it comes to it. And we should have more of a formal immigration process. And what you see too is with this with immigration and how it's being broken and why it's taking years as to process people is when it comes to like a lack of judges. So I kind of like pivot over there too. But I would like to give you last word on that as well, when it's not so much about culture and more so or just about how America, United States government specifically, has prosecuted different military campaigns, and a lot of people have suffered as a unfortunate byproduct of that or direct result.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that statement. Where I disagree is the conclusion that it's leading to, because I feel like it should lead to the opposite conclusion, where kind of like I
Mhm.
said earlier, how not enough infrastructure is the real problem. Open borders will just exacerbate that. The real problem is us making so many people hate us with our military decisions. And that's a whole other debate that we can spend hours and hours on. But like, if we're making people hate us and then we're not letting them into this country because we're afraid they hate us, that's just going to make them hate us more. Like, if the problem is them hating us, uh, the best way to make them not hate us is to welcome them into our house and treat them with kindness. If I were to personally accidentally blow up someone's house, even if it's for a completely justified reason, I don't know, there was a
Mhm.
terror cell attacking me and I had to blow up a house and I accidentally hit someone else's house. I guess I don't know. I'm John Wick. Like, there's, I would feel the moral obligation to be like, oh, I'm so sorry I destroyed your house. I have a spare room. Please stay with me as long as you need while you get your own place to live. Like, that would be like like, I feel like most Americans would agree with that. Like, that would be you'd feel a
Okay.
moral obligation to help that person.
Mhm.
So the government, in my opinion, should operate the same way.
But what if that like playing in that same example, what if that, missile, that blow up actually killed someone in that household? They're not going to want anything to do with you. But nonetheless, they may have, if you're the only house left standing or the only opportunity to go somewhere, they may have to, and they may hold animosity towards you. And I don't know if much is going to change that. And that's kind of like a point. I guess there may just be a fundamental disagreement. I don't disagree with kindness. I don't disagree with being welcoming people, opening arms. It's just more so an impasse. And I guess I pull that from my point of view. Like, if you destroyed my home, kill a family member of mine, like, yeah, I may come to your country. I'm never going like to enjoy Americans. I'm never going to like Americans. And no, that may be okay. Like, I accept that. I just don't think those people should be prioritizing an immigration uh process, to be honest. Maybe they should, maybe because we have a moral obligation. I think there's just specific concerns with that. But as I mentioned, I I also believe that that it's not the main thing that's happening with migration right now, like the major concern, but nonetheless is still like a concern when you have a border that's just wide open.
And I to clarify my position here, you said there should be some formal process, and I agree with that. I don't think we should just have anyone can come anytime they want, not declare. Like, I think people should enter through a legal port of entry. I think that they should become documented. They should let the government know they're going to be here. They should let the government know where they intend to move to. All of
Mhm,
that is good, and there should be some sort of background check. Like, I agree. We don't want a known terrorist just to come into this country. Like, I totally agree with that.
mhm,
But like, that should be however long it takes. Like if we let them in
yeah,
this country for tourism, we can let them in this country to live here. If they, like that, to me, that's the way it looks like. And by the way, most illegal immigrants, they didn't cross the border illegally. They legally crossed the border through a port of entry on a work visa, or something similar, and then just overstayed their visa and never left. And so like that is, if you're concerned about illegal immigration, that is how the majority of illegal immigrants end up being here. And I will say, like, to answer the thing about, they might have animosity towards you. Sure, 100% agree. However, there's no evidence that immigrants are any more dangerous to Americans than Americans are. In fact, immigrants, both legal and illegal, have lower rates of
mhm.
violent crime than the native born population. You are far more likely to be killed by a domestic terrorist than you are ever going to be killed by a foreign terrorist. If we are setting the bar for who gets to be here and who doesn't based on danger to the American population, it would make far more sense to kick out babies who are born here and to only allow immigrants. That's obviously absurd, but it kind of highlights the issues with with the position of keeping people out of here because we feel like they might be dangerous.
Yeah, no, and I wouldn't advocate for kicking people out, more so a concern when you have an open border and people may just need to come here out of necessity and they just simply hey, I see what you're saying. It's a fair point, but more or less a concern when the United States government prosecutes military campaigns a certain way, and then there's obviously going to be a lot of animosity from that, and it's not the best thing to cultivate, I would say, in a thriving community or nation. But
Yeah, and
mhm,
but that's been the case forever. We
yeah,
like the U.S.
yeah,
military has been that way for a long time. But like, I mean, we stole Texas from Mexico,
mhm,
we have done many, many bad things for a very long time. And yet we look back on all the past generations of immigrants and go, well, I'm glad they came here. And I feel like, fast forward 150 years from now, you'll feel the same way about, established Mexican families who have been here for three, four, 5 generations. It'll just take that time to get there.
interesting. Interesting. So, and I want to get more into that open borders process or just like the process you believe, because
Mhm.
do when you go about that and when you think about that, and you said there should be a process, do you almost think there's impracticality to that as well? And if there are, say, 300,000 people going through that process a year, and you agree there should be a process, do you almost see that as this wish list item rather than a practicality that could be established, just more so out of the workforce that's allotted, like such as immigration judges?
So again, I think this is more of a second order thing, but I think of all of the problems with open borders, that's the easiest to solve. Like,
Hmm.
do we have enough schools? Do we have enough roads? Do we have enough houses? As much as those are problems that I think can be solved, it takes some time to solve those problems, right? The Do we have enough judges? Do we have enough people processing immigrants? If we make the process a hell of a lot easier, uh, it'll take less time to process any one immigrant. And so that kind of solves the problem there. But even so, if we need to hire more people, cool, hire more people. To me, as I said earlier, immigrants generate more tax revenue than they consume in benefits. If we're stopping them from living here because we don't want to spend more on processing them, that would be like a store not hiring another employee because they don't want to spend the money on wages when that employee's the wages are going to generate more revenue because the demand is there. Like, that's my answer to that. Like, it's just hi, hire more judges, you know, like
Yeah.
hire more, social. Maybe we don't need like full on sitting U.S. judges. We could just do this with social workers. I again the specific nitty gritties of exactly how this is pulled off from a bureaucratic standpoint. That is not my expertise.
Yeah. And that's mhm.
But I do think that of all of the problems to solve, that is probably the easiest.
I would say I would say at the moment there's just an active effort to try and alleviate that. I think there's about 650 immigration judges that sit across 69 like courts or districts, and it's kind of and they're processing like hundreds of thousands each year,
Mm.
and that's just an issue that it's like as you said bureaucratic, but none like that's the exact problem. That's like bureaucratic in a way. So even going if you were to agree with open borders from a practicality standpoint of establishing it, not like a reason not to pursue it, I guess, in your mind, but I was curious on how you thought about getting that done from when there obviously need to be, say, more budget allotted or different policy changes. But that's fair not to really, I guess, think to the to that depth or granular detail when it isn't even being put really forward.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the generalized answer to that question is whatever money we spend on extra judges or extra, bureaucrats to handle this, we're going to make up in tax revenue because we get zero revenue if they don't come here, and we get literally infinite revenue over the course of the rest of time, at least until their entire family leaves America. And it would be dumb to kick ourselves and cut off that future revenue
Mhm.
because we don't want to spend a little, like we're the richest country on earth. We can afford it. It's an investment that is going to have a high ROI.
So when you think of like this and just the American population, how do you like contend with it? Just recent polling from a Harvard Harris poll that 70% of voters, including over 50% Democrats, 55% Democrats, believe that the current administration should impose, quote, new stricter policies to reduce the flow of people into this country. Where do you kind of fall in line there?
Where do I fall in line? Where like
That's
do
yeah, where do you kind of like find yourself thinking about that overall the American population wants stricter policies? Do you think they just don't understand it, or do you think like open borders policy, or what? How do you approach that?
I think it's more so a they don't understand it sort of thing. I think it is a result of propaganda because when I sit down and have these conversations with people, as much as I don't have 100% success rate at uh, getting them to agree to open borders, I do tend to have a lot of success with this argument of at least pushing people closer because there's a lot of dumb things. I think everyone can recognize there's dumb parts of our immigration system that could be, like you said, with the bureaucrats. Like we're imposing needless bureaucracy and it's stopping us from processing the amount of immigrants that we really need to be able to process if we ever want to stop the flow of illegal immigration. And so like there are a lot of parts of this where I feel like the American people, like if you ask the average American, they probably wouldn't tell you that an immigrant is less likely to commit a violent crime than a native born American. And that's just because of propaganda. Like that's just a factually accurate claim or inaccurate claim that a lot of Americans agree with. So I think that it's really, that's one of the reasons I talk about it a lot is I want to put these ideas out there because as much as I don't expect necessarily the American population to move all the way to open borders in my lifetime, at least, I do think that the correct answer is to loosen immigration restrictions, lessen the bureaucracy, increase freedom of movement, and collect more tax revenue. And I think that that is a answer that a lot of conservatives would also arrive at if it weren't for anti-immigrant propaganda and just
Mhm.
not having their facts straight.
I don't know if it's anti-immigrant, like some of it's stuff. Some of it's definitely anti-immigrant.
Anti-immigration, if
Yeah,
not
but
anti-immigrant.
I think it's something that you brought up earlier, and it's the chaos with it. Like just seeing tens of thousands of people do just this past Monday, 12,000 people enter the country illegally. Like that's chaos. I don't
But
think.
but
Mhm.
good.
No, no,
Oh,
no,
I
no.
I didn't
Continue.
mean to cut you off. I'm sorry, but
You're
like
good.
just It is chaos. I agree that it is
Mhm,
chaos. Like I completely agree. I don't want it happening this way either.
mhm,
But there's two options, right?
yeah,
Because we've generated the demand. Like the demand to come to America is here. And part of that is our own doing, guys. Like we're the land, come get the American dream. We're the land of immigrants. Like we have put this propaganda out into the world to get people to want to come here. And so we can't let go like, oh, well, how dare they want to come here? Like we told them to in a way. We have that Statue of Liberty who says something about it on her plaque, right? Like that's the reason they're coming here. We're not going to stop them from wanting to come here. They're going to keep trying, right? So we can handle it in one of two ways. We can spend more money to keep them out, or we can let more of them in legally. Because the only difference between an illegal and a legal immigrant is what we say, how many hoops we expect them to jump through to become legal. I would rather, if they're going to come here anyway, and we're already spending billions of dollars on this issue. So like, how much more money is it going to take to stop these hundreds of thousands of people more than we're already spending? Like either we spend all more billions to keep them out or kick them out once they're here, or we give them the option to enter through a legal port of entry, become documented, come here, pay more taxes, because as much as illegal immigrants do pay taxes, a lot of them don't because they're afraid of getting deported. And just do it legally. Give them an option to do it legally in a reasonable amount of time. And you'll see those 10,000 immigrants, probably 9,950 of them are going to choose to come here legally if they had the option to do so. Because why wouldn't they? That makes a hell of a lot more sense.
mhm, yeah. And something to go back to that we said originally too, which was the infrastructure in place. I think a lot of people also have concerns with them just becoming part of the quote like welfare state. That you're seeing like New York City, like Eric Adams said, by 2025 they'll spend more than I want to say 12 billion on just like housing. I'm sure other commodities and monies for these people, and I think that's a fair concern. And something I guess that comes to mind for me too is that as is, we have a massive homeless population, and we have copious amount of people dying from overdose. Like we have our own domestic problems that require government attention and funding, and a number of people that would need, say, assistance in some capacity. Are we really in a place to extend that to people that are just like coming over here willy-nilly? And when it's quote unquote low skilled labor that already is just kind of we have like in surplus.
Well, I mean, there's two parts of that.
Yeah.
One, we don't have a surplus of a lot of labor that immigrants do. We don't have a surplus of agricultural workers, 75% of which are immigrants, and half of those are undocumented. We don't have a surplus. I mean, we have a very tight labor market right now. Like there's a
Mhm.
lot of opportunity for employment, and we aren't having a problem with people not being able to get jobs right now. And I look at it like this. As I said before, immigrants generate more tax revenue than they consume in benefits. And yes, a lot of that revenue is on the tail end of their lives and generated by their children. But it's still a net positive in the long term. So as long as we have the money to be able to weather that storm right now, we have the capital to invest, which we do. Again, richest country in the world. If any country can do it, we can. We might as well invest that money now because it's going to pay off in the long run. Like it again, unless you're sitting here and saying, "Oh, well, the 10th generation of Italian immigrants, whatever the generation we have right now, I don't know what the number is, but like unless you're saying, oh, they didn't pay off, we overall lost money on the Italians. There's no reason to expect that we wouldn't also gain money on the Mexicans, on the Hondurans, on the El Salvadorians. There's over time it's just an investment that is going to pay off. So yeah, it's going to cost us money, but that's not money just burned. That's money invested in a workforce that I don't know if you've ever met any immigrant laborers, but are extremely productive with incredible work ethics. And the children of immigrants, first generation children of
Hmm.
immigrants, are pretty much the most productive demographic in American society, because they have that immigrant work ethic from their parents with the American, education mindset and, opportunities, social opportunities, and, cultural assimilation to let them be very productive in life. So to me,
Hmm.
yeah, we have plenty of problems, but immigrants are a way to solve those problems more often than not, in my opinion.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think not even as pushback, but when that comes to mind too, it's the delineation there between like the illegal immigration that a lot of people see, which is just pulling through certain like spots, and then also comparing that to actual like legal immigration, which I think both of us are in agreement for of actually having more streamlined process, to say the least.
Hmm.
But when you don't have that, and maybe we're just kind of gonna start to agree more on certain things, but when you don't have that, I think you also see just no processes or systems in place to have any establishment of where these people are going to live, or they also have no idea. I think you make a point as well when you're saying like they pay more in taxes. And I'm just curious on like because of their children and on the back end of their lives. But if we don't have anything in place for them at this moment, then I don't know. Like it's kind of like speculative, I feel, as if because if they're being housed by the state and they're low skill, then where is there really opportunity, I guess, for them to and say their children to get enrolled in school if they're undocumented, they're pretty much just living in hotels, and that's a concern I think a lot of people have as well, that it doesn't seem like it's being taken care of and it's go like bankrupt cities.
Yeah, well, I mean, the cities aren't gonna, again. I've said this multiple times, but we are the richest country in the world. We have plenty of money to invest in people, and when you invest in people, it tends to pay off. And I think that if you look at, again, the Italian immigrants that came in on Staten Island, like they basically got a stamp. They told them their name and they're like, okay, get off the boat, come in. There was no plan for them whatsoever. They just kind of set them off into New York. And yeah, no, that did cause a lot of problems. And we should probably have a better system for, integration, and setup and all of that than we did back in the, what was that, the 20s, right? If I remember correctly. And so, but if that worked out, you know, I see no reason why, with better technology, more money, why that would not work out this time. Like, yeah, it's speculative, but it's speculative based on all of the history that we've had, that allowing immigrants usually pays off, because none of us would be here if it didn't. And
Well,
America is one of the richest countries in the world, or the
it's
richest
not,
country in the world.
yeah, it's not like it's just immigrants. I almost want like steer away from like kind of coming off of this like the anti-immigration. It's more or less
Mhm.
the anti-illegal immigration that's currently occurring, at least from my position, and then the concern with open borders if there was just no limit on that whatsoever. So that's how I kind of approach it. But when there's something that you mentioned that I want to quickly touch on too, we're saying Staten Island, it's gonna elude my mind. But yeah, it
The
was just
Italian immigrants, the
yeah,
they eventually got here.
it was just there, it was just there. But what what was it? I mean,
I hate when that happens.
yeah, it was decent point, but I think irrespective of any of that, I was gonna say the richest country in the world. That's that there it was is
Mhm.
I think it's also a concern is like an unfair burden on the American taxpayer. And I know you've mentioned that they pay their taxes or like on the back end or just through different means, but nonetheless, if the government's going to obviously say spend more money, then that can come at certain amounts of inflation, and that just once again comes get like the taxpayer, the American like, taxpayer. So, and it's not like immigration versus anti-immigration, just valid concerns about the amount of people that you let in during a given time frame. as well as the amount of government assistance that population will need during any given time frame as well. And that obviously differs based on where they come from and what skills and background they're bringing over. Someone who is immigrating from, say, Bangladesh and has a college education or speaks English is going to have a much easier time assimilating and kind of moving their way up through social mobility than someone who is just kind of coming from somewhere else, like Guatemala, and didn't really have any of those opportunities, unfortunately, and they're just kind of being like thrown out there. And like and that's begs the question, like how much assistance are they going to need, and how much spending is like it's almost like the trade-off there, and how fair really is it as well. If we're I think you made a great point earlier with like marking the land with opportunity. That's something that the Buy campaign kind of really advertised and campaigned on quite a bit, and it may almost be like a false like promise to a certain extent. But
Yeah, I
I won't say
mean,
like a false promise, but more so misleading. They're gonna come here and just like make bank, whereas it's for example, California has a pretty high undocumented labor force and also has like the highest poverty rate because it is so expensive like to live there, and the United States is an increasingly cost of living state.
yeah, and first of all, with Biden, Biden does definitely sell a false bill of goods when it comes to immigration, because if you look at Biden's immigration policy, and I know a lot of Republicans are going to disagree with this, but it's really true. It's not all that dissimilar from Trump's. Like it's
Hmm.
pretty darn close. He kept Title 42 for longer than he needed to. In fact, he fought in court to be able to keep it. If you look at a lot of the policies, basically they're just like slightly more humane versions of what Trump was doing. And still, you have Republican politicians and pundits saying that Biden is letting open borders happen, to like someone who actually advocates for open borders. I'm like, oh no, he's not. I wish he was. And I always say, like, well, if we're going to get called, we're going to get called open borders supporters no matter what we do, us Democrats. And so like we might as well do it and try it out, because it's not like we're going to lose political capital over it. But to go back to your point, and I think you didn't say it this time, but you alluded to it and you said it last time, that the distinction between legal and illegal immigrants. And I hear that a lot. It's like I'm not against immigration, I'm against illegal immigration, right? And I'll agree with that, but and I think that at the very least you would move towards less restrictions, less bureaucracy, at least tying things up. And if you look at, is it fair to the American taxpayer? Okay, so we have an undocumented immigrant here, right? And again, we have a couple options. We can allow them to keep being here undocumented, which is basically what we're doing now. And they're going to be less likely to pay taxes than if we allowed them to get documented, which I think everyone can understand the reasons why for that. Um, Still, 50% of undocumented immigrants still pay taxes, but that's a whole other thing. So, like, if we're talking about what's more fair to the American taxpayer, our current position or just letting them become documented is only going to be beneficial towards Americans. And the only way that kicking them out would be beneficial is if kicking them out cost us less than the benefits they are consuming, which it doesn't. And also they end up generating the tax revenue later in life. So
Hmm.
like it's to me, like from a pure dollars and cents perspective, what's fair to the American people? I think it's unfair to the American people that we are spending taxpayer dollars to stop people from being able to live, work here, and pay taxes. It, I think that is what is unfair.
Yeah, I mean, I would delineate those two though. I think you're approaching that from like a reactive place though, like, and that's something that goes more into amnesty than illegal immigration. Like they could be a quote unquote illegal immigrant, but letting that person stay is more or less like an amnesty approach rather than saying going against illegal immigration, where I would advocate more of a proactive approach on it, such as say reducing the bureaucracy and just the process itself, so it doesn't seem like such a like whirlwind to enter this country, but to actually having secure borders. And that sounds so vague, right? Like, what does that even mean? But I think it means funding, say, the United States Customs and Border Patrol to the extent they may or may not need it. Having enough agents, having actual, say, what's the word I'm looking for? Construction where it's necessary, where it's like
Mhm.
not possible to be staffed 24/7, and there are weak points. So I think that is where I think I would draw more the line of where I fall down. It's not kicking people out who have been here for years and trying to like that's I mean you can make an argument for it and there may be like I'm sure there's some good points there, but I that's not where like I fall on like the illegal immigration part when I approach it. Illegal immigration is more or less having secured borders and ensuring that what's happening now is not repeatedly occurring. And at least may you probably think the same this with this is reducing some of those bureaucratic barriers that a lot of people see. But I don't even know if you did do that, and this is more speculative. If you did do that, that would still like, oh, it's not as hard now. Let's just go through it like legally. Like I don't even know if that would be the rationale in certain people's cases. Like when you have say different organizations, one say being the cartel, making a humongous profit and revenue off of a business, basically just trafficking people from through the United States border, whether they just give that up just because it's easier now. So I think regardless if you approach open borders or whatever, like you still need a secure border, irrespective of how you may like fall on it. But I'm curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good and valid point there with the cartels. And, I don't know where you personally stand on drug policy. But in my mind, it's good to have legal drugs. That our insistence on prohibition for drugs creates demand for an illegal drug market. And the cartels profit boku bucks off of that. And a lot of more libertarian leaning conservatives will totally be able to understand this, that by doing so we give the cartels the power that they have. If we were to legalize drugs in this country, the cartels wouldn't be nearly as powerful. There'd be less violence, there'd be less human trafficking. Same thing with our restrictions on immigration. We create a black market by not allowing a legal option to obtain a thing that people are always going to seek. People, again, just like drugs, we can't just snap our fingers and pray to God that people are just going to stop using drugs. We can't just snap our fingers and pray to God that people from these impoverished nations aren't going to want to come here to better their lives, better the lives of their family. Uh, we can't do like that's just unreasonable expectation. And so what can we do? Well, we can legalize it. We can give a easy, simple process for people coming over here. They will be incentivized to do so because A, they don't have to worry about being deported. And B, because they don't have to worry about being deported, they will get paid more. If you've ever spent time talking to undocumented immigrants, they'll tell you that, yeah, no, they often get worse wages. They often have more abusive working conditions because they're undocumented and they are afraid that they will be deported. In fact, there was a recent uh, trial that concluded, I forget exactly the company, but it was part of the food process supply chain for a lot of big grocers like Kroger and I think Sam's Club
Hmm.
was one of them. But like they had illegal immigrants who they basically put in a compound and said, well, if you don't do what we say, we're going to deport you. And they scared them to death and essentially got slave labor out of it. And it's like, yeah, if you give people the option to come here legally in a reasonable amount of time, I'm saying, a couple months to a year, I think it's possible to process them that fast. I think way more people are going to just decide, hey, I'm not going to risk it with the cartels. I'm just going to come over legally. I'm going to get a plane ticket, come in through the port of Miami, completely bypass the cartels, declare myself as an immigrant, become documented, and just do my job. I see. And what are the cartels going to do about that? Stop them at the airport? They're not.
Yeah.
And they're going to have less money because one of their business opportunities just dried up.
Yeah, I mean, my only thing I pointed out was like once it's like assuming it's taking the position reactively, like once they're already here, now they can't. They can't. They're out of fear. They won't like report these poor working conditions or look for different opportunity or allow abusive employer to manipulate them. Like that's once again all reactive after the fact. Um, but
Well, I'm
like,
interested as to why
mhm,
that distinction matters to you. Because, like, in my mind, it's like, okay, whether they're here or they're on the Mexican side of the border and they just want to be here, like, they're the same person to me. Like, it's just different
mhm.
stages of the person. And like, yeah, no, I totally agree. Let's loosen the restrictions, let more people come in here. Cool. But like, we're still going to have people who are here undocumented. And what are we going to do about that? We're still going to have people who want to get in here.
Mhm.
What are we going to do about that? You
Yeah,
know, like, it's all the same problem to me.
yeah, I think I think I would say they're different. Like something like amnesty is different from having stricter border or tighter borders. Like I would say that one could be for amnesty for X amount of people who meet this criteria, and then also advocate for a tighter border where you're reducing that, where you're reducing allowing illegal immigration to continue and flow. So I would say those are the mhm.
I still feel like you're not answering the why here. Like, why are those two things? To me, it's like, okay, all you should have to do is declare you want to become a documented immigrant. Wait for whatever, minimal bureaucratic process needs to be done to do a background check and make sure everything's cool, clean to go. And then boom, you are
Well,
an American, you're
well,
allowed to live here.
well,
And whether
that's
you do that
it,
from New
mhm,
Mexico or
mhm.
Mexico, it's the same process. You know what
I
I'm
s-
saying?
yeah, I see what you're saying. I think it's just the chaos in between that. Like when you see American property owners feeling worried about these just random strangers walking through the property, crossing on like the Texas border or Arizona where there's an influx there. Like I don't think that's fair to them whatsoever. So that's the concern I have is more as the chaos that occurs in between. And it's not all just like lovely like people as well. Like this past the fiscal year of 2023, I want to say that there was over 35,000 people apprehended that had like prior criminal backgrounds and or convictions or outstanding warrants. So that's what I'm saying. Like, so if you actually had an established process, you would avoid that. Like, I'm not to the point like say open borders, but I mean, I do see the merits of actually having like if you reduce the bureaucracy, maybe at minimum reducing the bureaucracy, allowing people to come through a more streamlined way, then you kind of avoid a lot of that in between of saying the wrong people with like prior convictions, like criminal convictions, I'm saying, are on a terrorist watch list, which has occurred in 2023. And then also the chaos and putting their own selves at risk. I think it's a little selfish, or not selfish, but a little cruel that this keeps happening, that people maybe have to go through the rivers and they are putting their own selves at, maybe not cruel, but it's just like wrong that they have to go through the rivers um to cross, and they're putting their own selves at risk. Maybe wrong again isn't the right word, but nonetheless they're putting their own livelihoods at risk when they're doing this. So that's why I don't like it from maybe a security point of view, and they're also just people are just putting themselves at risk. So I'll be like, if there's another way to do that just through more streamlined immigration in general, regardless of how many people you align on or admitted and granted permanent visas, is a different issue. But I think it's the chaos in between that kind of I would say I take issue with.
Yeah, and I think you're kind of coming to the point, and the reason why I think that a lot of Americans would be much closer to my position if they knew all the facts of, yeah, I agree, the chaos is bad. The chaos is caused by our current system. Placing more restrictions isn't going to reduce the chaos because these people are willing, as you said, to take dangerous treks across these rivers. I mean, Texas put up those, I don't know if you saw, but they put up like
Mm-hmm.
buoys with barbed wire on them, and people are getting stuck in it and doing all this. And it's like, if these people, you'd have to pay me a lot of money to swim across the Rio Grande, go through barbed wire buoys, and get to the other side. You'd have to pay me an ungodly amount of money to willingly do that to myself. So, like, if we just gave them an option to go through Miami,
Mm-hmm.
to go through a legal port of entry, they would prefer to do that than going across the border in all of these random locations and going through people's property. Like, that's what they would prefer to do. 99, unless they are genuinely a terrorist who wants to come here and kill us, that's what they want to do. Or they're smuggling drugs. There's really the two
Mm-hmm.
options that, like, why would they ever choose to cross the Rio Grande if they could just come here the same way I do when I come back from vacation, right? Like, that's what you're describing right now is what I advocate for with open borders. Like, open borders would be the absolute minimal possible barrier to entry, which would be pretty much what we give to tourists, right? And then like you're probably at some level a little more restrictive than that, but probably closer to that than what we currently have right now.
Yeah,
Which is why I think these conversations are very valuable to have.
they are, and we're probably where we don't agree is the no limit whatsoever.
Hmm.
I think when you bring up the economic point, we haven't spent too much time on this, but just looking at different evidence, like it's conflicted. Like there's certain libertarians, free market libertarians, that make the argument that you do, compelling argument. Then there's others, and then there's historical presence as well, and I guess maybe not. Well, I don't know. I actually didn't look at the United States, which was a little silly, but in other areas, in other places, such as UK, where it does create animosity when it's on like a large scale and between working class, and kind of only serves the larger corporation in the end, or just a larger, say, entity or group, really, a more wealthier group. And I think that's not somewhere I'm sold on, where like it's abundantly clear that that would be the right option, coming having complete open borders from an economic point of view, especially as you said, there is a tight labor market at the moment, and allowing just countless people to, come here legally. That's, I don't know if that would just simply undermine the working person and allow them, like, certain employers to offer less wages overall. And there is argument that, oh well, they, like, these people who are working there now, like Americans, would be the trainers and now be managers. But once again, it just is, that part just doesn't compel me to the same extent. But to your point, to somewhere where I think we do agree on is the lack of the, not lack, but rather the kind of unbearing bureaucracy that currently exists serves no one. It
Hmm.
serves absolutely no one. I think something, if you were able, as you said, figure out the workforce issue in regards to immigration judges, allotting the proper resources and allocating the bandwidth like necessary to support what we at least currently are dealing with, and then looking into possibly expanding that, that could be of benefit, that could be of use, I think, to everyone who's trying to come here. And I would say, like, somewhere where we may disagree as well, though, is the remain in Mexico policy, where I think that was not a bad policy, because at least it gave time. If you had the remain in Mexico policy, where, which is basically, for people listening, where you're applying for asylum, but you're doing it in Mexico or in a different country of, like, that's not the United States. Whereas a lot of times people, they get apprehended by border patrol, and then they apply for asylum after the fact of, like, getting here after crossing illegally. But I mentioned that if you had the
Well,
remaining.
let me correct you
Mhm.
there.
Yeah.
If they're seeking asylum, they didn't cross illegally. So it's legal to cross to seek asylum, um, which is one of the conflicts when it comes to the remain in
So
Mexico
you think,
policy.
yeah. Well, so if you the so this is where I guess I would like meet you halfway, is if you had the remain in Mexico esque policy, where they were applying for asylum in the United States, and I would say illegally, because I think a lot of people applying for asylum are not doing it off like actual, like, grounds that meet asylum grounds, which is basically the same thing for refugees, which is like due to fear of being persecuted, like a valid fear of being persecuted. And that's defined as, there's like a few number of definitions that meet it, but basically because of your race, gender, religion. But that's why I'd say illegally, because I honestly wouldn't validate a lot of those asylum claims based on those grounds. I would say they're more economic. But anyway, I'll close with this, and that is that if you had something that had you're applying not yet in the United States, but had a more streamlined process, as you said, like a few months to a year, I think that would be a nice, like, kind of meet in the middle there.
For sure, I would agree to that every day and twice on Sunday.
And like I said, probably like the amount I'm just not sold on. I think a lot of, like, there are like valid concerns with a labor market and what that would do to a working class, but and then also obviously a number of other concerns, but I think that's probably the biggest one that, like, would still come to mind, where there's like kind of more sufficient evidence that that could be detrimental.
Yeah, and we talk a
Mhm.
lot in this country about what, there's partisanship and all that, but I think that, if you ever heard of horseshoe theory of like you go far enough left or far enough
Mhm.
right, you start to see things melt together a little bit. And I think what we've discussed here is one of those things where problem with immigration, problem with the welfare state, A lot of the problems, like I have problems with them too. And I think the solution is also to just reduce government bureaucracy, give people what they need without as many barriers to entry. That's why I support things like universal health care, universal basic income, things like that. And I'm sure that a lot of people think I'm crazy for that. But if you look at these things, a lot of times we kick ourselves in the balls to stop people from getting things we don't deserve, and we end up paying more for it than if we just gave it to everyone.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of situations like that where the left and the right can look to come together and go like, okay, this doesn't make any sense. What can we agree on? And I think we could maybe make some
Mhm.
progress as a country if we view things that way.
Well, something at least in regards to healthcare is that a lot of people are just coming to the conclusion that like healthcare being tied to your employer is kind of ridiculous and
Hmm.
limits, economic opportunity in sense because you're afraid to lose your job and because your healthcare is tied to it. So, or I'm afraid
Hmm.
to start that business and entrepreneurship innovation. So, yeah, I think that's somewhere where the left and right kind of agrees in that regard. But we're pushing like an hour and a half. I just want to say, John, I want to give you the floor for last thoughts, anything that may we didn't get to, but would still like to speak on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we did a good job with immigration here. I'm sure there's a couple tidbits that we left on the table, but I think people kind of understand, the position from both sides, of from your side and my side. And I think the one thing to reemphasize is what we started this with is, we didn't necessarily come here agreeing on this. I genuinely didn't really know necessarily. I knew you disagreed with me, but I didn't even know your position coming in here. And we were able to just talk for an hour and a half. Neither of us got upset one
Mhm.
time, and we were able to come to an agreement on a position that is closer to what both of us want than the one that is currently being taken into effect. And I think if more people, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, if more people did that and were willing to have these sort of just respectful, not yelling, not arguing, but just conversations about what we want and why, I think the American people could start coming up with a lot better solutions than the politicians in Congress are coming up with right now.
For sure. Well, once again, John, thank you again for coming here. And for everyone listening, thank you for taking this listen. I hope you enjoyed it and appreciated the conversation. All right. Take care, everyone.